Why was the Germanic god Wotan, the Norse god Odin, linked to the Roman god Mercury? Also, Odin achieved 3 forms of magical wisdom: the runes, magic chants called Galdr, and the mead of poetry. But when did Odin become associated with runes? Because they didn't always exist. And why is it that myths are preserved for how he acquired runes and how he acquired the mead of poetry, but not for how he acquired Galdr? You'll find out today in Survive the Jive. You like Odin? Look at this shirt. This is a bracelet depicting an Odinic king of some kind with runes all around. You can buy it in my spring store. The link's in the description, or it's even tagged below here. So have a look at this and other t-shirts depicting Odinic imagery. About 7 years ago, I made a video in which I described Odin as the dankest of gods. It's achieved about 250,000 views now, and it's mostly just me sort of detailing the main sources we have on that god, and then afterwards I sort of make some speculations about the esoteric interpretations of Odin that I'd reached. Some people still tell me that they think it's the best video I've done, even though 7 years ago is a long time, and I've learned a lot since then as well, and it's also sort of changed some of my interpretations. I've made lots of other videos talking about Odin since then, and I think they're a lot more fact-based and reliable than that one. Although that one isn't that bad, it's a lot better than most of the ones on the internet you can find. And I did make it clear where I'm speculating and where something is absolutely known. But there's a lot of stuff I didn't even go over. It was only a half an hour long video. So today I'm going to talk about a few other things. Again, esoteric interpretations. This isn't just me going over the basic source material, of which many other people have done videos on that anyway, including myself. And you can go through my videos, like, for example, on anglo-saxon paganism to learn about Woden, or on my video about the horned spear dancer, where I specifically talk about archaeological evidence of Odin. I did a stream with Scott Shell recently when we talked about runic bracted evidence, such as this on the t-shirt, which show an Odin cult through these, like, connected to kingship. There are many videos I've done where the main topic is, in fact, this god, who the Anglo-Saxons called Woden, the Germans called Wotan, but we know most of all through medieval Icelandic literature, where he's called Odin. He is indeed the dankest of gods. 2017 humour hasn't stood the test of time very well, but that was considered a funny joke 7 years ago. But anyway, first I'm going to talk about his interpretation as being Mercury. And some people get upset about this because they say, why is he Mercury? Because Mercury is not the same as Odin. Mercury is the Roman equivalent of Hermes, and that god is not the main god of the classical, Greco-Roman pantheon. He is subservient to the main god Zeus. In many respects, Odin is more like Zeus because he's the king of the gods, the father of the gods. He's the chief god. It was a combination of Germanic people not really understanding the Roman religion and Roman people not really understanding the Germanic religion, which led to their being conflated from an early stage. And that continued for 1,000 years into Christian period, where Christians would refer to Odin as Mercury. What does Mercury have in common with Odin? Well, Mercury was a psychopomp. That means he led the souls of the dead, in the same way that Odin did, via his Valkyries. Mercury is also a god of trade, and Odin is called a god of cargoes. It's not a major aspect of Odin, but it is somewhat hinted at in the kennings that are used to refer to him. And also we know from the Arab Ibn Fadlan that Germanic merchants would make sacrifices to a god, presumably Wotan, in order to get good trade deals when they're out being merchants in the south. So yeah, it does seem that this is a sort of thing. Odin's also associated with war. So obviously the main kind of Germanic people that are going to come in contact with foreigners are going to be merchants and soldiers, and both of those types of people are going to be very focused on Wotan as their main god. At a surface level, there is an apparent equivalence between Mercury and Odin. after all. I don't know if I seem to maybe give the wrong impression in that video 7 years ago that Odin derives from the cult of Mercury in some way, but I don't believe that's true at all. I also said back then, and I've said subsequently, repeatedly said I don't believe this anymore, that I think Odin could have been a secondary god who usurped the primary god of the Germanic pantheon being Tyr. I no longer believe that to be the case. It was based on a linguistic argument that Tyr is the Sky Father, and I made a big video in about 3 years ago about the Sky Father, in which I explicitly stated that I don't think Tyr was ever the Sky Father, even though his name is cognate with the Indo-European word for sky. It just means Tyr does not mean sky in Germanic at all. It means God, and he has no paternal roles at all. Nor is he married to the Earth Mother Jord, or doesn't have sex with Jord. Odin does. He doesn't father the storm god. He doesn't have any of the roles associated with the Sky Father that Odin does. So if you want to attribute the role of Sky Father to a Germanic god, it has to be Wotan. Obviously, Mercury is not the Sky Father, that's Zeus, but that's just because the Interpretatio Romana is not an accurate way of finding equivalent gods. It just goes on very surface level attributes rather than like the entire an analysis of the mythic equivalents. But at an esoteric level, I think that you actually find more compelling reasons to sort of associate Odin with Hermes. And I'd like to talk about those today because I don't see many people talking about it, and it's just quite an interesting matter for esoteric consideration. And Odin is an esoteric god. The Great Rebellion is a new roguelike side-scrolling run-and-gun game available on Steam. It features fast-paced combat across randomly generated levels made up of thousands of handcrafted rooms rendered in beautiful pixel art. You are a resistant fighter of the future who has removed his Neuralink chip, defying the international Lucius Lux Corporation, which is intent on establishing a world government. The corporate brain implants have robbed your fellow Europeans of their identity, and so you fight back with the help of the spirits of Europe's heroes, such as King Arthur, Leonidas, Arminius, Joan of Arc, and many more. I really love the cyberpunk dystopian aesthetic. Choose from over 60 weapons with unique abilities and find countless items that give you special powers. One of which is the Survive the Jive subscription Runic Shield of Protection. You are part of the resistance against the evil global corporation which seeks to enslave us all.
You and all the other useless eaters in the world will perish.
You are mankind's last hope in a soulless technocracy. Immerse yourself in intense action sequences and epic battles with a dynamic soundtrack by synthwave artist Retro Rebel. The Great Rebellion currently has 99% positive reviews on Steam, where you can purchase it for yourself now. This game was made by a small, idealistic startup who intend to make many more dissident indie games if this one is successful. They deserve your support, so if you are a true gamer, then go and get The Great Rebellion. This is all about the relationship between Hermes and Prometheus. These are two Greek gods, and as I say, Hermes is Mercury. They're both givers of wisdom, and they give wisdom to mankind. Prometheus wants to take the divine gift of fire and give it to man. Hermes teaches mankind certain divine skills. He's like a divine priest that leads the path for mankind to worship the gods and become closer to the gods. That's exactly what Odin does. So I even said in that Odin video from 2017 that I thought Odin had equivalents in the Indic pantheon to Brahaspati, the divine priest, because Odin has that role, but so does Hermes. The crucial differences between Hermes and Prometheus need to be considered here, because they're both givers of wisdom, but one's good and one's bad. And one poses a challenge to divine order and is therefore, and consequently, he's bound and tortured. And that's his punishment, right? The same punishment is given to Loki. So Odin and Loki have this close relationship. And I think you kind of think about the equivalence of what I'm saying, Hermes and Prometheus and Odin and Loki. There's definitely some clear parallels here. So Loki's bound and punished for his betrayal of the gods. So is Prometheus. Hermes is good because he represents the divine order. He upholds divine order, and his gifts to mankind, his divine gifts to mankind, reinforce that divine order by showing them the path to the divine through sacred arts and rituals. The same is true for Odin. Hermes Trismegistus is the Greek version of the Egyptian god Thoth, and in this form, he also bears close resemblance to Odin, because Hermes Trismegistus gifted sacred arts to mankind, such as science, alchemy, and hieroglyphics. Of course, Odin gifted runes, and there's an obvious parallel here of a writing system gifted by the god, Hermes Trismegistus or Odin, to mankind. Hermes is obedient to Zeus, but Prometheus isn't. The obedience of Hermes to Zeus represents his obedience to divine order. In the Germanic equivalent, Odin can't be obedient to a high god because there is no high god. He is the equivalent of Zeus. He's like Zeus and Mercury combined in that sense. But he is obedient to divine law, whereas Loki is not. Both the Greeks and the Germanic peoples in ancient times valued trickery and deceptiveness as a kind of wily intelligence, especially when employed against enemies. The ability to deceive and trick your enemy was seen as a good thing. And therefore, we shouldn't be surprised when Hermes and Odin are seen as tricksters or deceivers in certain ways, and that's not necessarily negative. Loki and Prometheus are also tricksters, deceivers, but in their case, it is negative. Prometheus is a very wise titan whose name means forethought, and he fought in the Titanomachy against the Titans, despite himself being a Titan. He allied himself with the gods in that war between the Titans and the gods. The Germanic equivalent of the Titans are the Jotuns or Jotnar, and Loki is of Jotun birth. However, he, in most mythic contexts, is allied with the gods against the Jotnar, just like Prometheus. However, both Prometheus and Loki eventually revert to kind and ally themselves with their own race against the gods, becoming enemies of the gods. But the same warning seems to be there. Both of them are punished in pretty much the same way. They're bound and tortured. Prometheus is bound and tortured by having an eagle eat at his guts, whereas Loki is bound and tortured by having venom of serpents dripped on his face. In both cases, they are seen as having betrayed the gods. This kind of comparative mythology is useful for just sort of considering the meaning of the myths and how we are to regard these figures in a religious context. So people who are actually practicing pagans, it is helpful. Comparative mythology is not generally a religious discipline. Comparative mythology is done by academics for quite other reasons, where they're usually trying to find cultural relationships and forms of cultural transmission to explain why mythic parallels exist. I'm not trying to do that right now, whether this is because of sustained interactions between the Greece and Germanic people, or whether it's due to a common indo-european origin, outside the scope of this video. I'm talking from an esoteric perspective. It is useful to know about these parallels to help you understand the nature of Odin and Loki. Some people think that you're supposed to worship Loki, but I think that's a bit like worshipping Prometheus. Although Prometheus is not always considered in ancient sources to be entirely negative. He isn't the sort of person that they're going to worship, and there's absolutely no evidence that Loki was ever worshipped. I don't think that was the point. He is a nuanced character. He isn't entirely evil, but he is ultimately regarded as an enemy of the divine. And that is what's crucial, because Odin represents divine order. They're both deceivers. They're both very similar to each other, Odin and Loki. But Odin represents order, and Loki is ultimately opposed to order. That's the main takeaway that you have to have. Hermes is a source of wisdom for mankind. The gifts he gives help mankind to ascend to the level of the gods, to reach the divine. The gift of fire from Prometheus does not do that. It is a gift that helps him to oppose the gods. Think about those. I think they're very interesting points to consider. The next thing I'd like to deal with in this video is the nature of the three special wise arts that Odin acquires through sacrifice. We know really a lot about two of them, right? One, in Havamal, he describes how he hung on a tree and thereby acquired runes. Not exactly how, he just says he took them up. That's after 9 nights of self-sacrifice. He understood these runes. Who gave them to him? Was it the tree? Was it the Norns at the tree? It doesn't say this. The other myth of the mead of poetry, which is also a gift to mankind, although somewhat unintentional, is acquired. That myth is explained in detail how he has to get 3 drinks from the vats of mead underground, and then flees with the mead in the form of an eagle and drops it to earth. But the third art, Galdr, which means a chant or a song, a sacred chant or song, the plural is Galdra, and in Old English it was called Galdr. That myth is not explained, and I'm going to go over why I think that is. And this is a bit esoteric and a bit speculative, so you'll have to forgive me if you think that it's not. I'm not adhering to the evidence strongly enough, but I think it is a point that needs to be addressed and considered. Because I am an historian and a pagan, I have 2 hats to wear when studying myth. One of them is very much evidence-based, and the other is more spiritual. I find it's easier and best to keep them separate because they're very different things, and you wouldn't want one to contaminate the other. Christian and Islamic theologians are frequently challenged by historians who study Islam and Christianity because the historical method is not concerned with adherence to theological doctrine. They're just trying to uncover the historical context in which these religions grew and were constructed. The assumption is that if you're studying Christianity or Islam in a university, the assumption is that this is a belief system that was made by humans and a certain point in history, and that you can look at the sources and figure out when that is. But that fundamentally goes against what Christianity and Islam are. They're like both considering that the source of these traditions is a god. So there's this conflict. Normally, that conflict doesn't exist for heathens because our myths do not take place within a historical context. The myths take place outside time, in an eternal time. Some of them are said to refer, to take place in the past. The terminology used refers to them as in the past, and some of them is said to take place in the future, like Ragnarok. But really, they all take place in a sort of outside the historical, timeline that we've acquired since Christianity introduces the concept of a year zero, so we count every year, year 1, year 2024, etc. However, there are some instances where we are challenged as heathens by the historical method. Because, for example, Odin learned the runes. But we know from linguistics and archaeology and the development of runic writing, and we can trace it in the archaeological record, that runes were invented at some point. There is a historical date when runes were made. And there was a previous period where there are no runes. So we can place runic writing into a historical timeline, a profane timeline, just like Christians place the birth of Jesus onto a profane timeline. But the problem is the myth of him hanging on the tree. It's not like we have to say, Odin, that's the day Odin hung on a tree and acquired these runes. But what we need to try and understand is how did Odin come to be associated with this new technology, the system of writing that we call runes. So runes are about 2,000 years old. We can say that with confidence, about. They could be a bit older, a few centuries older, maybe a few centuries younger, but definitely 2,000-ish. In that period in history, Odin would have been known as either Wotanaz or Wotanaz or Wotanaz, something like that. That was the Proto-Germanic spoken at the time, which means the same thing that Odin and Woden does, which is the prefix wod or order wod in Old English and order in Old Norse means like a divine frenzy. And then word n just means one, in one. So he's the frenzied one, or the one of divine ecstasy. It's a kind of divine frenzy, like a gift of ecstasy from the gods. And he is the god associated with that. And so that's reflected in his earliest name, which can be reconstructed reliably as Wotanaz or Wotanaz. The earliest runic writing that we have is on a comb from a bog in Funen in Denmark. That's dated to approximately the 2nd century. But, the dating is a little bit, there's intervals of, exactly how long it could be, a century off or so. So it could be 1st century. But they also recently have discovered a runestone from around the same time. So it's somewhere between the 1st and 3rd century. So averaging out about the 2nd century. And that's a stone, making it the earliest rune stone, if you can call it a rune stone, which is a grave marker in Svingerud runestone, it's called. It's found near Oslo. And both of them reveal that there's already a sophisticated, developed form of writing. So neither of these are examples of a brand new system of writing. They're the oldest we've got on the record, but they're definitely not the start of runes. So they're nearly 2,000 years old, but obviously runes are older than these objects. So we can say that's why we say maybe it's 2,000, maybe it's around the birth of Christ, maybe a little bit older, could be probably not much more than 200 BC at the earliest. The Germanic languages, Proto-Germanic language is generally dated to be around 500 BC. So the runes emerge just a few centuries after Germanic languages do. And of course, Germanic languages, no one ever realized they were suddenly speaking Proto-Germanic. Proto-Germanic is just a different variant of earlier indo-european languages spoken in the same region that probably sounded a lot like Proto-Germanic, well, did sound a lot like Proto-Germanic, but we don't have any way of reconstructing them. It's certain that they were based on a different script, but we don't know which. Most people agree it's either going to be based on the Latin script, based on the Greek script, or based on maybe Lepontic or Etruscan. The Lepontic scripts from the Alps is one opinion. So we don't know which, but what's certain is that it doesn't, well, from what I understand of what people who are more versed in the science of linguistics and of development of script specifically, it does not appear that the runic script could possibly have derived naturally from the usage of any of those scripts. One day they were writing ABC and then suddenly they're writing Futhark. It just can't happen. This runic alphabet called the Futhark was deliberately created by someone who was familiar with another script and basically was like, I want to invent a new script. Or a group of people, either a person or a group of educated people who knew about these other foreign scripts decided to invent a new script made for purpose for the use of Proto-Germanic language. And that developed over time into other runic scripts like that for other Germanic languages, like Futhorc for Old English and the younger Futhark for Norse. That's interesting because the idea of an elite making the runes fits very closely into what we know about the elite nature of runic usage early on. So this elitism in runes is clear in a lot of the early runestones refer to the person speaking. They're expressed from the perspective of the Erelas. So the word Erelas is Proto-Germanic and becomes the English word earl, the Norse word jarl. And it is some kind of it's not the same as what earl means. It's some kind of high status title that has some connection to the ability to use runes, but is also a social position. So they're boasting of this. People, the Erelas carved the runes, or that is interesting because in these inscriptions in Proto-Norse, for example, sort of prefigure what we see much later in Icelandic literature, where we have written sources for Germanic mythology, And in there, like for example in Rigsthula, it's made very clear that runes are exclusively for an elite. A boy called Conr is the only one of the sons of Jarl, which is the same word as Erlaz, who is permitted to learn the runes. And this is like establishing a sort of caste society. And Conr, to give you an idea of what kind of a man Conr is, and why he was given this privilege of learning runes, I shall read the following from Rigsthula. Conr rode through swamps and forests, luring birds and shooting them, when a crow spoke to him. Then sang the crow, sitting lonely on a bough, "Why wilt thou, young Con, tame the birds? Rather shouldst thou, young Con, on horses ride, and armies overcome." The point there is, he's a military man. He's military aristocracy. And he speaks to a bird, and we know from the other myths, like the myth of Sigurd, who is, descended from Odin's specific bloodline, a hero, a dragon slayer, that he acquires the ability to speak to birds by sucking the blood of a dragon. And this is like an Odinic skill, an Odinic ability, the ability to speak to the birds. And it's also, as is the ability to use runes, and Odin is also very much a martial god, not like Mercury, more like Mars in that respect. Like this is a god of war. So we're associating runes from the earliest stage with a martial elite aristocracy who have the runes as a privilege. Most people would not have been able to understand runes. And it's important to understand the explicit connection of the aristocracy with the cult of Odin. So Odin is a god of aristocrats. And to be an aristocrat is to be a warrior, a knight, basically. They didn't have knights like in the Middle Ages, but it's the social position out of which the knight of the Middle Ages comes from. It's the same thing, like knights were aristocrats, basically, in many cases. Now I'm going to come to the other topic of Galdr, because the connection of Galdr to runes is what I'm trying to get at and to explain it. And to do so, I'm going to read from the Poetic Edda. This edition is from Imperium Press, and it's got a foreword by yours truly. So if you want to read what my opinion on the Prose Edda is, you should get this version of the Poetic Edda, which has the text in both Norse and English. And I will read the English translation of the relevant passages relating to how Odin won the runes now. "I know that I hung on the windy tree, hung there for nights full 9. With the spear I was wounded and offered. I was to Odin myself to myself. On the tree that none may ever know what root beneath it runs. None made me happy with loaf or horn, and there below I looked. I took up the runes, shrieking I took them, and forthwith back I fell. 9 mighty songs I got from the son of Bolthorn, Bestla's father, and a drink I got of the goodly mead poured out from Othrurir. Right, then I began to thrive, and wisdom to get. I grew, and well I was. Each word led on to another word, each deed to another deed." Now, here you've seen, he describes the mythic self-sacrifice through which he acquired runes. Then he mentions 2 other things he learned, Galdr, and how he got a drink from, it just says a drink, but in the myth he got 3 drinks from Othrurir, of the sacred mead of poetry. That, in between the reference to this 9 mighty songs he got from Bestla's father, that's the only reference to this. We don't know any more about it. That means it's his maternal uncle, by the way, his mother's brother. And in Germanic culture, the relationship between a boy, a man, and his mother's brother is very special. That is like a foster. That's basically like a second dad. So this person is responsible for teaching that boy a lot of things. Who is this unnamed person? We don't know. But he is of Jotun ancestry, because Bullthorn is a Jotun. Some people think that this could be Mimir. There's a third myth besides the runes, acquiring the runes and acquiring the mead of poetry. There is a third myth that we know of Odin acquiring some special wisdom. And that's when he goes to the well of Mimir. Mimir's Brunner sacrifices an eye, and in return he gets to get the wisdom of the water of memory from Mimir's Brunner. Now, Mimir could well be a Jotun, and he could be Odin's maternal uncle. And that would explain why Odin wanted to preserve his head after the war when he was killed. Mimir was killed, and he wanted to preserve this with special herbs and leeks or whatever, and thereby acquire more wisdom from Mimir in death. It's possible. In the myth in which Odin sacrifices his eye at Mimir's Brunner, it isn't specifically said that he learns Galdr. So maybe that isn't the myth where he learned the Galdr. It's one possible interpretation. Another is that it's actually a part of the myth where he learns the runes, because immediately after he says he hangs on the tree, and then he falls back, and then the next stanza it says, and I learned 9 mighty songs, Fimbuljuth, mighty songs. So, and Ljuth is a type of Galdr, basically. So it's possible that runes and Galdr are almost the same thing in that sense. So, there's no clear explanation for why. We have all this explanation for the mead of poetry being how he acquires that in Skålskopamål. But the winning of the 9 Galdra, why don't we know more about it? I really think that there's a connection between runes and Galdra, and I'm going to explore that now to sort of demonstrate why I think this. I think this connection is as old as the runes are, that it came about as soon as runes were invented. So, as I said, runes are about 2,000 years old. Of course, the heathen tradition is much older. Germanic heathenism wasn't just invented as a religion when Germanic language was suddenly come about. And as I said, Germanic language was never invented. It's just a variant of an earlier Indo-European dialect of language or whatever that became what now linguists refer to as Proto-Germanic. There was no transition into Proto-Germanic. It just, it's an arbitrary stage in linguistic development that we find useful to refer to now. So heathenry, the religion of Odin and these gods that we associate with the Germanic people is obviously older even than the Germanic people, because it's clearly with Indo-European origins and continues on. Many of the burial practices, for example, are 5,000 years old and go right back to the Indo-Europeans that were used. These were ones carried on being used by Vikings only 1,000 years ago. So they're that's 4,000 years of continuity there. So of course, we can't imagine that the entire myths were invented for purpose, even when a new technology like runes were invented. So it seems to me that prior to runic literacy, Odin, or Wotanaz as he was known, was already associated with magic, and specifically with poetry and Galdra. And that when the new technology of runic writing was invented, it naturally became associated with this god, because this is a god of wisdom, a god of words, of chants, of magic. Runes were like a magical system as well. They were literally used for magic, but in fact, writing itself appeared as a kind of magic to spell, cast spells. And of course, if they're going to associate this new thing with a god, it's obviously going to be Odin, the god of the aristocrats, the god of magic. Now, the word rune itself doesn't have any relationship to writing. It's an old word that means secret, esoteric secret. So the fact that the Germanic people decided to apply the word rune to these symbols used for writing shows a lot about how they regarded this system of writing. We can also get a bit of insight into what rune means from Finnish, because Finnish language is not Indo-European or Germanic. Of course, Germanic is Indo-European. So it's completely unrelated to Germanic. But because of the fact that Finland is, parallel to Scandinavia and has so much close contact with it, there are some very old Germanic loanwords into Finnish that have been preserved, whereas the Germanic languages develop into other languages, Proto-Norse becomes Norse, etc. Finnish has like old words, like the word for king, konungas, is very like Proto-Germanic word for king, a very, 2,000-year-old Germanic word for king. So the word rune was also lent into Finnish, but it does not mean a system of writing. Rune or runo in Finnish means a sacred song. Basically, it means Galdr. Specifically, Finnish runo refer to songs that are about their myths, which is exactly the sort of thing you would call Galdr in a Norse context. I think that it's unlikely that the Finnish people borrowed a word that means writing and then changed its meaning so that it meant song. I think probably at the time that the Finns borrowed the word rune, or runo, into Finnish, it was used by Germanic people to refer to sacred songs, Galdr. This can explain why runes and Galdr are so closely associated in magical contexts as well as mythic contexts. For example, in Grettir's saga, the witch, she cuts runes onto a tree stump, then she reddens the runes with her blood to sort of activate them magically, and then she sings a Galdr over them. And the combination of runes and Galdr here can be called a magical charm or a magical spell. And I think very often performing a magic spell involved a combination of runes and Galdr. Also, in Sigrdrífumál, the Valkyrie, Sigrdrífa, brings the hero Sigurd, who asks her for wisdom, good Galdr and runes of gladness. So the two gifts are given together, good Galdr and runes of joy. That's the way that they're paired there seems like a formula, an old formula that's been used in other contexts. In Snorri Sturlusson's Lausavísur, he refers to Odin as Ein Skapur Galdra, the sole creator of Galdr. And in Ynglinga saga chapter 7, where the many skills of Odin are listed, it says that he taught the art of runes and of Galdr. The two again are said together, which is why it says the Aesir are called Galdr smiths, the ones who create Galdr. Well, apparently the Aesir are called that because Odin makes them. But there's no description of the others as actual Galdr smiths, but he says that because of Odin, the Aesir can be called Galdr smiths. So Odin taught runes and Galdr. We know that. And again, the two go together in the sense that they were given to man by Odin. They're both magical systems, and within magical context, we know that the two were used simultaneously. They go together in the magical context too, and they were taught by the same god in the same way. And in the mythic description of how Odin acquired runes, it seems to say he acquired Galdr at the same time. Open to interpretation. Maybe it isn't saying that. Maybe it's saying he actually got them from Mimir at Mimsbrunner, but I'm not sure about that. I mean, no one can say for certain, but the just juxtaposition of the two stanzas, it does seem to be saying that that's where he got them. Although in the same stanza where it talks about the Galdr, it says that he won the drink of mead, which refers to a myth that it doesn't go into in any detail. So it could be the same thing is happening here, that is just referring how he got the Galdr without going into any detail. But then the three things combined, runes, Galdr, and the mood of poetry, are what he says caused him to grow in wisdom and flourish. And these are the things you need to acquire, the knowledge of runes, Galdr, and the mead of poetry, if you want to flourish in this way. It doesn't say he got the Galdr from Mimir, but it doesn't say in the previous stanza that he got the runes from anyone. It just says he got them. So it could well be that there is no individual person involved in giving Odin the Galdr or the runes. He just acquires them through the self-sacrifice at the same time. I'm very tempted to think of it that way because the way that Galdr and runes are paired in so many sources as two things combined. They're taught by Odin simultaneously. They're given by the Valkyrie simultaneously. They're used by the witch simultaneously. As a heathen, the myths to me are eternally true. So the profane historical development of runic writing, which occurred within our profane space, this world, this middle yard, that does not have any effect on the ultimate metaphysical truths contained in myth. And I think Odin's role as the god of runes is just a natural extension of his much, much older role as the god of Galdr, chants. And prior to the technology of writing all over the world, we see that the earlier, more primitive form of knowledge, preservation, and transfer is ritual chanting or songs. Because, as you may know from watching television adverts, jingles just stick in your head. You can probably remember the exact song and all the lyrics to something you heard in a television advertisement when you were a small child, because they stick in your head. And knowing this fact, this quirk of the human mind, religious authorities understood that it was necessary to communicate divine truths in the form of like chants or songs. And that's how the Rig Veda, the oldest text in India, the oldest actual written form of it's only about 1,000 years old. But we can tell from the language contained in it that it is about 3,500 years old and long predates written Indo-European languages in India. So how was it so well preserved as a Bronze Age form of language up until the present, into the modern era? Well, up until the invention of writing, or Indo-European writing, because there were earlier non-Indo-European writing scripts there. But the answer is through chanting, because that tradition of chants exists still in India, where young children are taught to chant the Rig Veda, the children of Brahmin, the Brahmin caste. Like in Germanic religion, only the higher caste can learn the sacred things. The lower castes are actually forbidden from hearing the Rig Veda recited. The Rig Veda was too sacred for the lower caste. So they had to learn it, and they have these head movements to help them remember all the verses, learn really, really large texts in this way, quite effectively, can be learned. The same thing you should imagine for the Homeric epics in Greece. These were not entirely invented by Homer. Lots of them are from stories, older stories that date back to the time of the Trojan War probably, and would have been preserved long before Greek literacy through chants or songs. And because that is basically like writing before writing, and it helps you to memorize. It's hard for us with our short attention spans, constantly scrolling on our phones and stuff, to imagine having this ability to just memorize an entire book. Like this Edda, definitely people would have been able to recite these poems off by heart. A single skald could have done that. But that's just because they didn't have these distractions, technological distractions. And even writing, even books, represent a technological development on the path to our mobile phones now, where that's why the Celtic Druids and indeed the Brahmins in India were initially opposed to writing, because they saw it as a corruption, preventing people from learning to pass on sacred knowledge in the former way, which is through these chants. Of course, these chants weren't just profane forms of information sharing. They were sacred. They were passing on sacred knowledge. And that, although most systems of writing, when they initially are invented, are not sacred. Usually, especially like we can think earliest examples of writing are quite profane usage, like counting stocks and stuff like that. But Germanic runes seem to be an exception, because they appear to have been deliberately invented by a religious elite and have always had a religious connotation from the very beginning, which makes them quite special, I think. And this association, I believe, is because they were being deliberately used to convey things that had formerly been magical spells expressed through chants, Galdr. And that is my belief why Galdr and runes are so closely tied together, and why it was so natural for Odin to just assume the role of the god of runes. And you can imagine, therefore, that this god hanging on a world tree and acquiring a divine magic thereby is much older than 2,000 years. And I've proven that as much in my video on the world tree that grows from hell, when I show that there are not only across the Indo-European world related myths of this world tree growing in the underworld, that there are even related myths of a divine priest hanging on the roots of this tree among Native Americans. So it could well be that the Odin myth goes back even earlier than Indo-Europeans, right back to the Ice Age, where Europeans and Native Americans have a common ancestor living in Siberia. Really, really old. So I certainly do not believe that it was invented, the idea of a god sacrificing himself on the world tree in 2,000 years ago just to explain runes. That's implausible. What I think is they just grafted on the knowledge of runes to the existing knowledge of Galdr, which Odin was associated with. And then, of course, the use of runic magic naturally was integrated into the pre-existing use of magical chants. Hence why we see they are so clearly connected within magical contexts. Do you agree with me? Have I missed out some important insight into the development of runes or Galdr that would render invalid my interpretation? If so, please let me know in the comments. I have lots of things to say about Odin. I could make lots and lots of videos about them, but maybe I'll have to wait another 7 years before I do another one like this. But I felt like doing this because I thought this is worth considering, and the intersection between academic historical learning and esoteric interpretation. I think a lot of people who are actually practicing pagans can arrive at, quite wise conclusions through religious insights just from regular practice, use of the runes, use of Galdr. Well, one thing's for sure, both Galdra and Runar are sacred and associated with Odin, and they're part of our religious tradition. I will be soon releasing a special online learning course called Starting Heathenry, which has been specially developed using a method called micro-learning, so that it is perfect for you to absorb the information in small chunks of small videos combined with reading, and this method has been proven to be the best way for learning now. And with many people today are very busy and they are bombarded with information on all sides, and so it's important to have a form of information exchange that facilitates learning that sticks in your mind. Starting Heathenry as a course will teach someone, even from the earliest stage, how to practice heathenry. It is not, like this video, an interpretation of mythology. I do not discuss mythology in it. Every book and video talking about how to be heathen seems to focus on mythology and how to interpret Eddic texts. You don't need to pay for that. But people keep coming to me and say, how do I actually do it? What do I do day to day to be a heathen? How do I actually perform a blut? How do I actually get the gods to accept my sacrifices? How can I have them answer my prayers? What do I need to do? These questions I've been asked over and over again for years, and I decided that the best thing to do would to make a proper learning course, a distance learning course that you can access via your phone. You can do the lessons on your phone, you can do them on your computer, and you do it in your own time in increments until you complete the course. So keep an eye out for Starting Heathenry. It will soon be available online. Watch this space. In the meantime, I really appreciate everyone who watches Survive the Jive. And if you feel like you can help me, I do urge you to become a patron on Patreon or Subscribestar, because this channel can only go on with your generous donations to fund me. You get in return access to exclusive videos that no one else can see, lots of content. Additionally, you get to join the Telegram voice chat, which happens sometimes, where we all get together and I chat with my patrons and answer their questions. And if you can't make that, you also get priority for your questions to be answered for the Jive Talk AMA. Jive Talk is my second channel, and that is devoted to interviews and live streams. So if you can't get enough Survive the Jive on this channel, make sure you subscribe to Jive Talk as well. You'll find the links on my channel, the link to the other channel as well. So please please subscribe, please share this video with anyone you think might have some useful insights about the nature of Odin, his relationship to Mercury, Galdr, and runes. keep surviving the jive, and goodbye.